Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Tuesday, August 30th, 2022. Get right into it here. The first story at the top of antiwar.com. The IAEA sends a team to Ukraine to inspect the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, they have sent a team of inspectors to Ukraine, and their mission is to inspect the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi said on Twitter on Monday that the inspectors will be at the plant later this week. Now, this nuclear power plant, it's been controlled by Russian forces since March, but the plant has been the site of frequent shelling recently, raising fears of a potential nuclear disaster in the country. Now, Ukraine has blamed the shelling on Russia, but Moscow, they have little reason to attack a plant that they control. Russian officials have been calling for an IAEA inspection team to visit the plant, saying that the inspectors will be able to see that Ukrainian forces are the ones that have been behind the recent attacks. Both Russia and Ukraine welcomed the IAEA's announcement. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said that the inspectors were set to arrive in Kiev on Monday, so they could already be in Ukraine. And from the Ukrainian capital, they're going to travel to the power plant, which is located in the Zaporizhia Oblast. It's southeastern Ukraine. And Russia controls the majority of that oblast, of that province. And there's a Russian installed military administration running that area. And the governor, the Russian installed governor, said that, welcomed the IAEA plans and said that the inspectors, their safety will be guaranteed while they're in the area. And he said that the officials, they will use this opportunity to, quote, provide evidence that Ukraine is behaving like a nuclear terrorist state, end quote. So again, Russia's saying that, once these inspectors get here, they're going to be able to see it's Ukraine that's been attacking this plant. So far, the UN has not blamed either side. They've stayed pretty neutral, although it does seem obvious to me, at least, that it's Ukraine that's been attacking the plant just because Russia controls it. But Russia does have troops there, it's militarized. They've rejected UN calls to demilitarize the plant. They're claiming that if they demilitarize, then it's going to be vulnerable to more Ukrainian attacks. What's interesting is that while Ukraine has been blaming the shelling on Russia, they've also said that Russian troops are launching attacks from the plant and drawing fire. So that's kind of an admission that it's actually Ukraine that's been attacking the plant. But just the whole situation is just a mess and so dangerous and seems so reckless that hopefully whatever happens here could put an end to the fighting around this plant. The plant is on the Dnieper River. On one side of the river, there's the plant, and Russia controls that and the territory around it. On the other side of the river, it's Ukrainian controlled. And we haven't seen another thing that tells me it's Ukraine that's been shelling this plant. And this has continued. I mean, there was reports over the past few days of attacks on the plant. It's not like this has really slowed down, but the US and the Europeans, they haven't really come out strongly and blamed Russia for attacking the plant. They've been calling for Russia to demilitarize and all that. But I haven't seen them, I mean, unless I've been missing something, come out and blame the attacks on Russia. So that really says something, I think. And so this IAEA mission could be pretty revealing, although it's possible that it's an organization that can be pretty politicized, which we could get into when we talk about Iran later. But it'll just be interesting to see what happens. Okay, so the next one here, this is from Connor Eccles at Responsible Statecraft. Pentagon stockpiles are uncomfortably low due to Ukraine arms transfers. And this is based on a report from the Wall Street Journal that cited some Pentagon officials who said all these arms that we're pouring into Ukraine, it's leaving our stockpiles low, uncomfortably low. Specifically, they were talking about artillery ammunition. The U.S. has sent just tons of this artillery ammunition to Ukraine for howitzers that the U.S. has sent and other types of artillery. The Pentagon official said, quote, "It is not at the level we would like to go into combat," end quote. So now this means that the Pentagon is looking for more weapons, and it's just more of a boon for the U.S. weapons manufacturers. Eccles said that the news shows just how dramatically American weapon stocks have fallen in recent months in order to support Ukraine's defense against Russia's invasion. It also highlights the massive financial windfall that arms manufacturers will receive in the coming months and years as taxpayers fund a boost in weapons production. Pentagon has already pledged to send nearly $13 billion in arms since the war began. Now, most of those have been through what they call the Presidential Drawdown Authority. That's taking from the U.S. military stockpiles and sending it to Ukraine. This official saying we're sending too much, which could be, just an effort to get more weapons, to get more money spent on weapons. But I think there's definitely some truth to this. When you just look at the sheer numbers, and, I bet you could look back at all those weapons packages and add up that artillery ammunition and see that it's just a ridiculous amount that the U.S. has sent. But again, this is more just the weapons makers, Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all these companies are just totally cashing in on the Biden administration's policy of shipping all these weapons to Ukraine. The next one here, the U.S. to appoint a new Arctic ambassador with eye on Russia. So the Biden administration announced this Friday that it will appoint a new ambassador for the Arctic, a region that the U.S. military and NATO view as a potential battleground with Russia. U.S. Arctic policy is currently handled by an official in the State Department, but the Biden administration wants to establish a full ambassador, which would require Senate approval. The U.S. and its NATO allies are looking to expand their military footprint in the Arctic, and the military alliance's territory in the region could increase if Sweden and Finland's memberships are approved. They are both Arctic nations. Just a little bit of their territory is above the Arctic Circle. Norway is also an Arctic nation. Russia has just a massive coast, about 15,000 miles of coastline above the Arctic Circle. So, of course, the U.S. with Alaska is there, Canada, Greenland, Iceland. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he said that Russia's capabilities in the Arctic are a strategic challenge for NATO. Stoltenberg made these comments while he was in Canada, where he welcomed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's plan to increase spending for NORAD, which is a joint U.S.-Canadian military command meant to provide air protection for the two nations. So Stoltenberg was just in Canada. He met with Trudeau. Yeah, that's what Stoltenberg does. He goes around and tries to get NATO countries to spend more on their military. This is a little more specific. It's the Arctic. They want this focus on the Arctic. And Stoltenberg and Trudeau, they visited a Canadian military base, up north in the Arctic Circle, where there is an air defense radar for this NORAD command. And earlier this year, Canadian military leaders said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine means that they must spend more on Arctic capabilities. And the U.S. military is really preparing for a future conflict in the Arctic with Russia as well as China. China isn't an Arctic nation, but I guess they're saying that this area of the world is going to become a potential battleground in this so-called great power competition, as they call it. A lot of the branches of the U.S. military, they've released strategy documents on the Arctic. One that the U.S. Army released last year said that the Arctic has the, quote, potential to become a contested space where the United States' great power rivals, Russia and China, seek to use military and economic power to gain and maintain access to the region at the expense of U.S. interests, end quote. The U.S. Navy, they released a similar strategy document back in 2021. And the former Navy Secretary at the time when this strategy came out, said that the U.S. could start challenging Russian claims to the Arctic by sending warships near Russia's northern coast. That's something they do in the South China Sea, to challenge Chinese claims to these islands, these reefs and rocks in the South China Sea. They're talking about starting to do that way up in the Arctic, not far from Russia's coast in the Arctic. It's just another area where the U.S. military wants to expand. And it's definitely a region to keep an eye on as things go on, as tensions continue to escalate with the U.S. and Russia and China. Okay, the next one here, we're getting into Iran. Former Israeli officials urge Israel to prepare military action against Iran. So this is more Israeli pressure against the nuclear deal as the U.S. and Iran are negotiating this agreement. And it seems close, at least it seems closer than it's ever been under the Biden administration. But still, again, very skeptical of this deal happening. Former Israeli intelligence and military officials have urged Israel to prepare for military action against Iran as these negotiations are going on. This is from the Palestine Chronicle, which is a good source for news on Palestine and Israel. In an interview that was published on Sunday, Amos Gilad, he is the former chief of Israel's Defense Ministry's Political Military Affairs Bureau and former National Security Advisor Yaakov Amidror. They called for Israel to start making preparations. Basically, the gist of it was that they're saying Israel's efforts to squash the deal to get the U.S. to abandon negotiations aren't going to work, so Israel must prepare these other options. Now, many current and former Israeli officials, they always claim, like these two do, that the JCPOA is a path to a nuclear-armed Iran, even though the agreement just puts Iran's nuclear program under these very strict limits. But the issue is for the Israelis is that the agreement eventually expires. It's not forever. But after the JCPOA, as I mentioned many times, Iran is still a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, still subject to IAEA inspections under the NPT. And of course, Israel does not sign that treaty, and the U.S. does not pressure it to, even though Israel has a secret nuclear weapons program. The U.S. doesn't acknowledge it, and Israel, they just pretend that it doesn't exist. And that's where you really find the hypocrisy in this rhetoric from these Israeli officials, especially here. Gilad, he claimed that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it will ignite a regional nuclear arms race. Now, this is a talking point we see a lot from Israel, and it just totally ignores the fact that they have nuclear weapons. Which is their stockpile. It's estimated to be between 90 and 300 nuclear warheads, the Israeli stockpile. I've seen those are lower estimates. I've seen higher estimates, I think up to 500, but most are in that range, around 200, 150, things like that. And then also on Monday, former Mossad chief Yossi Cohen, he bragged that during his time as the head of the spy agency, Israel carried out countless operations against Iran's nuclear program. Israel frequently launches covert attacks inside Iran, but they rarely acknowledge these operations. Cohen said, quote, "Without going into many details, I can tell you the Mossad had many successes in its fight against Iran's nuclear program. We operated around the world and on Iranian soil itself, in the very heartland of the Ayatollahs," end quote. So Cohen was the Mossad chief from 2016 to 2021. And during that time, Israel carried out a lot of attacks inside Iran. Most notably was in November 2020, the assassination of Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And that came towards the end of the Trump administration. And I was following this stuff really close then. It seemed like Israel was trying to provoke a war with Iran or get the U.S. to bomb Iran during Trump's final few months there. And Cohen was also the head of Mossad during the April 2021 attack at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. Natanz, it's a facility that Israel has attacked several times, and this has led to Iran building nuclear facilities deep underground. But this attack, it coincided with the beginning of U.S. and Iranian negotiations. So it was a clear attempt to sabotage negotiations. And now these Israeli officials, the ex-Israeli officials that I quoted here, and others, they always say that they have to use force against Iran. It's the only way. Yesterday, I went over, Benny Gantz was telling the U.S., you need a military option. It's the only way. But these attacks and force against Iran have resulted in Iran increasing the activity of its civilian nuclear program. That's what it is. It's a civilian nuclear program, which is the very thing that these Israeli officials say they're against. After Fakhrizadeh was killed, the Iranian scientist who was assassinated, Iran began enriching uranium at 20%. After the Natanz attack in April 2021, they started enriching some uranium at 60%, which is the highest level they've ever done. It's still below the 90% needed for weapons grade, but it's still the highest they've ever attempted, and it's a result of these Israeli attacks. And now, if this is their concern, if they care about this stuff, the JCPOA, it limits Iran's enrichment levels to 3.67%, which is very, very, very low. All right, the next one here, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, he said Monday that in order to revive the nuclear deal, Iran must resolve its issues with the IAEA over safeguard agreements, referring to the nuclear watchdog's inquiry into uranium traces at undeclared nuclear sites in Iran. Raisi said, quote, without resolving safeguard issues, talking about an agreement would be meaningless, end quote. So IAEA investigators discovered small traces of uranium at undeclared Iranian sites years ago. This was several years ago. While the traces were not a proliferation risk, the IAEA has continued its investigation since they were unexplained. Earlier this year, Iran gave the IAEA what it said were documents explaining the uranium traces, but the nuclear watchdog was not satisfied with that explanation. So its investigation continues. And there were reports that said this was a condition for Iran to agree to the revival of the nuclear deal, to bring its nuclear program back into the JCPOA limits. They want the U.S. to lift some sanctions, and they wanted the IAEA to end this investigation. But last week, a U.S. official said that Iran dropped this demand. So Raisi's comments kind of contradict that. This U.S. official said a deal was closer because Iran dropped this demand. So Raisi's comments suggest that that might not be the case. Although his remarks, they could also be meant to portray to a domestic audience that he hasn't caved to Washington, just trying to show that he's not giving in to too many U.S. demands, because since the Biden administration has refused to lift all Trump-era sanctions on Iran, Tehran has had to make significant concessions to the U.S. in order to even have this conversation that they're having now, including dropping the demand to have the IRGC lifted from the Foreign Terrorist Organization. So Raisi, he said from the beginning, they call him a hardliner, and he's definitely more hardline than his predecessor Hassan Rouhani, but he is still willing to really make some serious concessions to the U.S., to Joe Biden, the hardliner American president. Because his thing from the beginning, he said if they lift all these sanctions, Biden could have done it with an executive order when he first came into office, but he didn't. So the EU, they're really hoping to get this done because they want to get this Iranian oil on the market as they're facing soaring energy prices. Their foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, he said, so right now, as I've gone over a lot lately, Iran is reviewing. The EU put in this proposal to revive the deal in an effort to get it going. Iran responded to the EU proposal. The US responded to that response and the EU's proposal, if that's not confusing enough. And now Iran is looking over the US response. And they're not expected to give their reply to that until the end of this week, September 2nd. Until at least then. It could be longer. We'll see what happens. More Iran here. This is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. Iran begins enriching uranium with new advanced centrifuges at Natanz. So this is at that facility that Israel frequently targets. These are IR6 centrifuges. They are advanced centrifuges, and they're enriching. Some of them are enriching uranium at 5%, while others aren't enriching uranium. This is really just a type of centrifuge that Iran would have to disconnect, shut down, if it were to return to the JCPOA. I don't know too much about this centrifuge stuff. It's a little complicated, but what I do know is that they will have to disconnect a lot to get back into the agreement. And from what I understand, they've been looking for guarantees that they wouldn't have to totally shut down these centrifuges to the point where they would have to rebuild them. They would want to guarantee that, say, to set it up. So if the U.S. pulled out of the deal, they would be able to set up the centrifuges pretty quickly. So it would be give the U.S. a consequence for pulling out of the deal, because the U.S. can't guarantee that a future administration will stay in the deal. So a guarantee like that, it's pretty smart, I think, to go for something like that on Iran's part. Um, all right, so the next one, Biden to ask Congress to approve $1.1 billion arms sale for Taiwan. So this is according to a report from Politico, citing sources with knowledge of this new weapons package they're looking to sell Taiwan. The Biden administration, they're planning to ask Congress to approve a $1.1 billion sale for Taiwan that includes anti-ship missiles and anti-air missiles. The arms package will include 60 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and 100 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, and a surveillance contract extension for a surveillance radar system. Once the Biden administration notifies Congress of its intent to make the sale, it starts a review period, but there's so much support for arming Ukraine that the deal will likely be easily approved. So the planned sale, this comes after Nancy Pelosi made her trip to Taiwan in the beginning of August, sparked the largest ever Chinese military drills around the island. And since then, Taiwan says it's going to increase its military budget, and part of that will go towards weapons procurement, buying weapons from the U.S. And now we see this new military package. So again, the U.S. goes out and provokes China, and then now they have to do something. And part of that is selling more weapons to Taiwan. The U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan since the 70s, since 1979, when they severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan and recognized China. They've continued arms sales. So this isn't new necessarily, but the arms sales have increased in recent years as the U.S. has increased support in other ways for Taiwan, including these frequent delegations. We had Nancy Pelosi, Senator Markey, the governor of Indiana, and then the woman that was just there, senator from Tennessee, whose name I'm blanking on. The 4 U.S. delegations went to Taiwan in August in 1 month. That's a lot. It's significant. So the U.S. is really poking China, and then they turn around and say, oh, we got to sell them some weapons. We got to send ships through the Taiwan Strait. Okay, so the next one here, clashes erupt in Baghdad's green zone after Sadr resigns, at least 15 killed. So supporters of the influential Iraqi Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr stormed government buildings in Baghdad's green zone on Monday after Sadr announced what he called was his final retirement from politics. The Sadrists clashed with Iraqi security forces and rival militias, according to the Associated Press. As of Monday night in Baghdad, at least 15 protesters have been killed in the clashes. Middle East Eye reported that rockets were consistently falling in the green zone late Monday night, and that fighting was spreading across Iraq, and with heavy gunfire reported in the southern city of Basra. So more fighting could still be going on in Iraq. It's Tuesday morning there now. So, but the U.S. Embassy is located in the green zone. The green zone is an area of Baghdad where there's embassies and government buildings. And a shell landed near the U.S. Embassy during the fighting. The U.S. called for dialogue as these clashes were going on, and they said there was reports that the U.S. was evacuating its embassy in Baghdad, but that turned out not to be true. The U.S. said it was false, and it was really just based on there was a helicopter on top of a roof of a building in the green zone, and there was a video of it. That kind of just went viral. So that's what the claim was based on. It doesn't, maybe some people were evacuated because it seems like there were some serious clashes, gunfire, rockets being fired. So maybe some people were evacuated, but it's not like it was a full evacuation or anything close to that. Sources told Middle East Eye that Sadr has called for an end to the fighting, and he went on a hunger strike. He said he's gone on a hunger strike until the violence and the use of weapons stops. An official of a militia linked to Sadr said that hopefully, the fighting, the violence should stop once they see that Sadr has told his supporters to stop. So Iraq has been stuck in a political deadlock since the October 2021 elections. The pro-Sadr faction, they won most seats in parliament, but they failed to form a coalition government. Sadr's party couldn't form a government without a rival Iran-linked Shia faction known as the State of Law. Sadr refused to work with this group and ordered his MPs to withdraw from parliament, so they gave up 73 seats in parliament. This happened back in June. Since then, Sadr supporters, they've staged sit-ins near government buildings, and they did storm parliament recently. But this was the first violence that erupted as a result of this political crisis. And the reason why Sadr refuses to work with these other Shia factions, he says that it would go against his promise to root out corruption. And he's more independence minded, and he does not want to run a government that's beholden to either the US or Iran. He's a more nationalist, and that's what his supporters are. And there's a lot of them. But hopefully the violence settles down. But I mean, it's just an example. It's just what a mess the US has left in this country. And it just doesn't seem like this. Hopefully this violence settles down, but it really doesn't seem like the political deadlock is going to be resolved anytime soon. So more stuff like this could happen thanks to the US regime change in Iraq and everything that has followed since. All right. So we got another one in here about China that was just posted up. It's from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. Chinese strategic bombers will join regular patrols near Taiwan as U.S. warships cross strait. So as American warships crossed the Taiwan Strait this weekend, the Chinese People's Liberation Army announced that H-6K strategic bombers and aerial tankers will now participate in regular patrols near the island. So this is really just an example of, since Pelosi visited Taiwan, there's been some serious military pressure on Taiwan. Planes have crossed the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait just about every day. And now they're saying that these bombers are going to be deployed as part of these regular military exercises around Taiwan, which is a consequence of Pelosi visiting the island. The last one on the page here, the Yemen government claims dangerous escalation after 10 troops killed in Taiz. This is from Jason Ditz. So there was reportedly an overnight attack in the Yemeni city of Taiz that left 10 soldiers killed. And this is the Yemeni government, the Saudi-backed, U.S. Saudi-backed government that's been really ruling over Yemen in exile since 2015, since the Houthis pushed them out. But they do control some areas. And they're saying that there was some fighting in Taiz, which is a city that the Houthis have under siege, and they've been calling for them to lift that blockade on the city, while the Houthis are calling for the Saudis to lift the blockade on the country of Yemen. The Saudis have left some ships in. They've let some ships into Hodeidah, and they've let some flights out of the Sinai airport. But still, the ceasefire that's been going on, we haven't seen any Saudi airstrikes in the country since March still, which is really great, but it's very fragile. And this is really an example of how fragile it is, how anything could really spark this war to turn really bad again soon. And it's just such a brutal war, and all the people in the country are still suffering under the blockade that's not fully lifted. And until there's a real end to the war, they're not really going to get much relief. Okay, so that's it for the news. That was a lot of stuff. I think this was the longest show I've done yet, but you can contact us at news@antiwar.com. Donate, antiwar.com/donate. Subscribe to our newsletters, antiwar.com/newsletter. And that's it for me for today. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow with some more news. Thank you for listening. Have a good one.